He placed $10,000 on the table in front of her and said, "Choose on one side of that money a future she had never dared to dream of. On the other side, her father, lying in a hospital bed with machines breathing for him." The room was cold. The fluorescent light above her head hummed like a warning, and every person in that village, every neighbor, every elder, every woman who had watched her grow up with bare feet and empty hands, they all expected her to reach for the money. She looked at that stack of bills. She looked at the man who had placed it there, a man so powerful that even the hospital director called him sir and stepped aside. And then Grace did something nobody in that room could have predicted. She pushed the money back. What happened next broke a man who had never been broken before, and set an entire village free from a lie that had lasted 20 years. Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one, and tell us from where you are watching from. To understand what Grace did in that hospital room, you must first understand the man who put the money on the table. His name was Victor Osei, and in the town of Efua, Victor Osei was not simply a wealthy man. He was the weather. When he frowned, loans were called in. His compound sat on the hill above the town like a king's palace, with iron gates that opened with a sound like thunder, and a garden tended by 3 workers, who trimmed each hedge as though they were afraid of it. Victor drove a black Mercedes that left a trail of dust on the dirt roads below, and the dust itself seemed to bow behind him as he passed. He had inherited his wealth from his father, multiplied it through land dealings and contracts with the regional government, and wore his success like armor. But armor, as any elder will tell you, is heaviest on the inside. Victor Osei had been married once. His wife, a gentlewoman named Abina, had died 11 years earlier. Suddenly, in the middle of a Tuesday, with breakfast still warm on the stove and a half-read letter on the kitchen table, he had never spoken of her again. Not to his workers, not to his only brother. The grief lived in him like a closed room, locked, silent, and full of things he could not face. He tested people. That was his habit, his obsession, his strange and private ritual. He believed that everyone had a price, that beneath every kind smile and soft word was a number, and if you found that number and placed it in front of a person, the mask would fall. He had tested his business partners this way. He had tested politicians. He had tested his own employees. And every single time, without exception, the mask had fallen. The money had been taken. The truth had been confirmed. He was not a cruel man, or so he told himself. He was simply honest about human nature in a way that other people were too cowardly to admit. Now understand. Grace Mensah, and lived in a two-room house at the bottom of the hill that Victor's compound sat upon, the poorest family in the shadow of the richest man. Her mother had died when Grace was 9, leaving behind a father named Samuel and a daughter who learned very young. That love was not a feeling, but a decision made fresh every single morning. Samuel Mensah was a tailor, not a successful one. His hands shook slightly from an illness that had crept into his joints over the years, and the shaking made his stitching uneven. Not badly, not so anyone would refuse his work, but enough that the wealthy clients on the hill sent their fine fabrics elsewhere. He worked long hours for little money, and he never once complained about it where Grace could hear. What he did instead was sing old songs, the kind his own mother had sung about rivers and morning birds and the patience of the earth. Grace had grown up falling asleep to those songs. She could not hear a river without thinking of her father's voice. She worked 2 jobs. In the mornings, she cleaned the offices of a small trading company on the main road. In the evenings, she sold ground nuts and plantain chips from a wooden tray at the junction near the market. She saved every coin that was not needed for food, electricity, or her father's medication for his joints. She had a notebook where she wrote down every expenditure in small, careful handwriting, the handwriting of someone who knew that one careless decision could undo a week of sacrifice. She was not bitter about any of it. That was what people noticed about Grace first, that she was not bitter. She laughed at small things. She greeted neighbors by name. She gave the last of her groundnuts to the old blind woman who sat outside the church on Fridays without ever counting what she lost by doing it. But there was one shadow over her life, one thing that kept her awake in the quiet hours after midnight. Her father was getting worse. The joint illness had moved deeper, and the local clinic had said, quietly but clearly, that Samuel needed surgery. A procedure that the clinic could not provide. He needed to go to the city hospital. He needed specialists. He needed money that Grace, for all her saving and sacrifice, did not have and could not reach. It was this shadow that Victor Osei had heard about, and it was this shadow that gave him his idea. It began on a Wednesday morning. Grace was on her knees, scrubbing the floor of the trading company's entrance hall, when she heard footsteps behind her, not the quick, purposeful footsteps of a man going somewhere, but the slow, deliberate footsteps of a man who had arrived. Victor Osei stood in the doorway. He was wearing a white shirt, open at the collar, and he looked at her the way people look at an interesting puzzle. Not unkindly, but without warmth. Grace had seen him before, the way everyone in Obuakwa had seen him from a distance, from below, from the periphery of a world that was not hers. She stood up. She did not wipe her hands on her dress. She looked directly at him. "You are Samuel's daughter," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "I am Grace." He nodded slowly. "Your father is unwell." "He is," she said, and her voice was steady, though her heart was not. Victor Osei reached into his shirt pocket and produced a business card. He placed it on the reception desk beside her bucket of soapy water, the clean white card landing on the edge of the wet surface like a declaration. "Come to my compound at 6 o'clock this evening," he said. "I have a proposition for you." He left before she could answer. The door swung closed behind him with a soft click that echoed in the empty hall. Grace stood very still. The water in her bucket had gone gray. The morning light came through the window at an angle and fell across the business card, and she stared at it for a long time without touching it. She went, at 6 o'clock that evening. She stood before those iron gates on the hill, and they opened for her with that sound like thunder. A worker led her through the garden. The hedges were trimmed with terrifying precision, and the smell of cut grass was thick and green in the cooling evening air, and into a sitting room that was larger than her entire house, with ceiling fans turning slowly overhead like the wings of something enormous and sleepy. Victor Osei was seated at the far end of a long wooden table. He gestured to the chair opposite him. He studied her for a moment. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. "Everyone in Obuakwa knows who you are," she said. "Do you know what I want from you?" "No," she said. "You said a proposition." "I came to hear it." Something moved behind his eyes. It was brief and difficult to name. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. He had expected, perhaps, nervousness, gratitude, the particular softness that poor people sometimes wear in rooms full of wealth. Grace wore none of it. He placed his hands flat on the table. "Your father needs surgery," he said. "The total cost, hospital fees, specialist fees, medication, transport, recovery, is $10,000. I know this because I inquired. I will give you that money tonight. All of it. Cash." Grace said nothing. Waited. "There is one condition," Victor said. And here was the first layer of the truth, the layer that the town of Obuakwa would talk about for years afterward. "You must leave Obuakwa," he said, "permanently. You take the money. Your father gets his surgery, but you go to another city, another region, wherever you choose, and you do not return. You cut your ties with this town. You leave your father in the care that the money will provide, and you start your life elsewhere." The ceiling fans turned. A gecko moved on the far wall. "Why?" Grace asked. Victor's jaw tightened. "That is not part of the proposition. The proposition is simple. $10,000. Your father's life. A new beginning. Yes or no?" Grace looked at him across the length of that long table. This man who owned the weather in a book, who had placed a number in front of her as though she were simply the latest in a long line of puzzles to be solved, and she asked the question that became the new, unanswered shadow over everything that followed. "What did my father do to you?" Victor Osei said nothing, but something in his face, just for 1 second, quick as a blink, cracked. Grace went home that night and did not sleep. She lay on a narrow bed in the dark and listened to her father breathe in the next room. Shallow, labored breaths, the kind that made her own chest ache in sympathy. And she turned the evening over in her mind like a stone, looking at every surface of it. Victor Osei had not answered her question. She had told him she needed time. He had given her 48 hours. She did not tell her father any of it. Samuel Mensah was proud in the way that quiet men are proud. Not loudly, not defiantly, but with a dignity so deep that it was impossible to wound without first getting past it. He would refuse the money. She knew that, without asking, he would refuse it and get worse, and eventually she stopped that thought. She began, instead, to investigate. The next morning, after her shift at the trading company, Grace went to the one person in Efua who knew everything about everyone, a woman named Auntie, who was 73 years old, had lived in the town her entire life, and whose memory for other people's business was as sharp as a new needle. Auntie Efua lived behind the church in a house that smelled of camphor and dried herbs. She was shelling groundnuts when Grace arrived, and she looked up with the particular expression of a woman who already suspects what you have come to ask. "You are here about Victor Osei," Auntie Efua said. It was not a question. Grace sat down. "What do you know about him and my father?" Auntie Efua was quiet for a long moment. Her hands continued their work, the groundnuts falling into the bowl with a soft, rhythmic sound like rain on a tin roof. "Your father and Victor Osei grew up together. Did you know that?" Grace shook her head. "Same Argay, same street. Best friends, the kind that finish each other's sentences." Auntie Efua paused. "Victor's father, old Kwame, you say. He was not always rich either. He became rich through a land deal many years ago. But the story of that land deal is not the story people tell." "What is the real story?" Grace asked. Auntie Efua looked at her steadily. "The land belonged to your grandfather, and your father knew it." The groundnuts fell into the bowl. Grace's hands were very still in her lap. Auntie Efua continued, her voice dropping into the register of women who speak truths they have held too long. "Your grandfather, your father's father, owned a piece of land on the eastern edge of what is now the main road. Good land, flat land, the kind that could be farmed or built upon. Old Kwame USA approached him with a business proposition, the way Victor had approached Grace, a proposition with numbers and conditions and a handshake at the end. Your grandfather signed papers he did not fully understand. Within 3 years, old Kwame had the land documented in his own name. The deal constructed in such a way that your grandfather's claim dissolved. The land was sold to the government for the road expansion. The money made the ASA family, and your grandfather died a few years later without ever understanding how completely he had been cheated. Your father, Samuel, knew all of this," Auntie Efua said. "He was young, but he was smart, and he found the original papers that showed what your grandfather had agreed to and what he had actually received. He went to Victor's father. He told him what he had found. He said he would not make trouble. He would not go to authorities. He only wanted the Osei family to acknowledge what had happened, to say, 'Your grandfather's land made us, and we are sorry.'" "Did old Kwame acknowledge it?" Grace asked. Auntie Efua's face tightened. He had Samuel's copies of the papers taken from him. He told Samuel that if he ever spoke of the matter again, he would ensure that every door in Efua closed against the Mensah family. And Victor, young Victor, your father's best friend, was there when his father said it. He said nothing. He did nothing. He let his father's threat stand. Grace stood up slowly, as though the weight of this information had become physical. "So the friendship ended," she said. "The friendship ended," Auntie Efua confirmed. "And your father, who could have made noise, who could have told a story, he kept his word. He never spoke of it publicly. He shrank himself into this corner of the town and sewed clothes and sang songs and raised you alone. And Victor Osei became the most powerful man on the hill." She looked at Grace with eyes that had seen far too many versions of this exact story. "And now the son of the man who took everything from your grandfather comes to you, the granddaughter, and offers you money to disappear. Do you understand what he is doing?" Grace understood. He was not testing her humanity. He was protecting his legacy. If Grace left, if she took the money and disappeared, there was no one left in Abawakwa who knew the original story. Samuel would be cared for, silenced by gratitude and distance from his daughter. The Osei name would remain clean on the hill above the town. The land deal, the papers, the betrayal, all of it would go with Grace into whatever other city she chose to inhabit. She walked home through the market, past the women selling tomatoes and yam, and the children chasing a football between the stalls. The afternoon sun was red and heavy on the horizon. She passed the junction where she sold her groundnuts in the evenings, and she paused there for a moment and looked down the hill at her father's house, small, clean, the curtains she had sewn herself, visible in the window, and she made her decision. But first she needed the papers. She went back to Auntie. "You said my father found papers, original papers, the ones old Kwame took from him." Grace's voice was quiet but tight with something that had no name yet. "Are you certain they were taken? Or is it possible my father kept copies?" Auntie Efua looked at her for a long time. "That man sews things and keeps things and never throws anything away," she said finally. "If I were you, I would look in the box under his work table. The brown wooden box with the brass latch. He moves it when people come. He moves it the way people move things. They are afraid to lose." That evening, while her father slept, his breathing shallow, his face relaxed in rest into the young man he once had been, Grace knelt beside his work table in the small room that served as both his workshop and her memory of childhood. The room smelled of fabric and machine oil, and her father's particular warmth, a smell she had never been able to describe to anyone else, because some smells are only for the people who grew up inside them. She found the box. It was heavier than it looked. She opened the brass latch with careful fingers. Inside, wrapped in a piece of old cloth that had once been a shirt, were papers. Old papers, their edges brown, the ink faded to the particular gray of things that have survived longer than expected. She spread them carefully on the work table. And there it was, her grandfather's name, old Osei's name, dates, numbers, signatures, and at the bottom, in handwriting she did not recognize but that felt old and careful, a note, the land given in trust. Not for sale. For the family. Her grandfather had not sold the land. He had placed it in trust, a community arrangement that old Kwame had twisted. Through legal documents her grandfather could not read, into a private transfer. It was fraud. It was documented fraud. And Samuel Mensah had kept the evidence for 30 years, in a box under his work table, moving it when strangers came, protecting it the way you protect a truth you know you may never be able to use. Grace photographed every page with her phone. Her hands were not shaking. She was surprised to notice that she had expected to feel afraid. Instead, she felt something quieter and more certain, the feeling of a river finding the ocean. It has always been moving toward. She replaced the papers exactly as she had found them. She closed the box. She latched it. She stood up in the smell of her father's room and breathed. Slowly, 40 hours remained of the 48 Victor had given her. She used 39 of them to do one more thing. She found Victor's younger brother. His name was Daniel Osei, and unlike Victor, Daniel had left Abawakwa at 20, studied law in the capital, and returned only for family events and the occasional uncomfortable holiday. He lived in the capital now and was, according to Auntie, a man who had spent 20 years quietly disagreeing with everything his family had done. Grace called the number she found through a mutual contact and explained, in careful and economical language, exactly what she needed him to know. Daniel was quiet for a long time after she finished speaking. "The papers still exist," he said. "Yes," she said. Another silence. Then, "My father told me, before he died, that there was something he had done that he was not proud of. He would not tell me what it was. I always suspected it was connected to the land." His voice was careful, measured the voice of a man choosing words like steps on uncertain ground. "Victor knows the full story. I have always believed that." "Will you help me?" Grace asked. Daniel said. Yes, the 48th hour arrived on a Friday evening. Grace walked up the hill to Victor Osei's compound as the sun went down, and the iron gates opened for her again with that sound like thunder. She was shown to the same long sitting room, the same ceiling fans turned overhead. Victor was already seated at the head of the table, and this time there was something different in his bearing, a tension, a watchfulness, as though he had spent the past 2 days waiting in a way he had not expected to be waiting. Grace sat down across from him. She placed her phone on the table between them. "I have an answer for you," she said. "Good," said Victor. His voice was composed, armored. "And what is your answer?" "Before I give it," she said, "I want to ask you something. Have you ever told anyone in this town what your father did to my grandfather?" The ceiling fans turned. Something moved in Victor's eyes. Something vast and controlled and old. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said. "That is not true." Grace said quietly, "You were there. You were 17 years old, and your father told my father to be silent, and you said nothing. You let your best friend be threatened into silence, and your father took a dead man's land and built everything you have inherited on top of it." Victor's jaw tightened. "You are a young woman making very serious accusations." "I am not accusing," Grace said. "I am describing. There is a difference." She turned her phone screen toward him. The photographs of the papers filled the screen, her grandfather's name, the dates, the signatures, the note at the bottom in old careful handwriting. Victor looked at the screen for a long time. His face did not change. That was the most frightening thing. It did not change. "Where did you find those?" he said. "My father kept them," Grace said. 30 years. In a box. Moving it whenever strangers came. The way you move things, you are afraid to lose. He never used them. He gave you his silence as a gift, not because he was afraid, but because he did not want to destroy the son for the sins of the father. That is the kind of man my father is. And you came to me with $10,000 and told me to disappear, because the only thing standing between your clean name and the truth is a sick tailor at the bottom of this. Hill and his daughter who sells groundnuts at the junction." Silence. The gecko on the far wall had not moved. Victor Osei looked at the photographs for another moment. Then he said, in a voice that had lost some of its armor, "What do you want?" "I want you to hear what I will not do," Grace said. "I will not take your money and disappear. I will not sell my father's silence, or my grandfather's memory, or my own presence in this town for any number you put in front of me. That is my answer to your proposition." Victor leaned back in his chair. Something was happening to his face, slowly, like a tide going out. "Then what will you do with those photographs?" "I will tell you what I am prepared to offer you instead," Grace said. "Your brother Daniel is a lawyer. He knows the full story now. He believes, and I agree with him, that a public legal case would be painful for your family name and ultimately inconclusive after 30 years. But Daniel has proposed something else, and I have agreed to it. The Osei family makes a formal acknowledgement, private, witnessed, documented, that the land that built your fortune was not legitimately acquired from my grandfather. The Osei family establishes a fund, not $10,000, not a private payment to make me leave a community fund, administered transparently, that provides medical care for families in Abuakwa who cannot afford it, starting with my father, and it continues after my father, in perpetuity, named, if you have any remaining dignity, for my grandfather. Victor Osei stared at her. "You have done all of this," A sighed slowly. "In 48 hours. I had good reason too," she said. "And if I refuse?" Grace stood up. She picked up her phone. "Then Daniel files a civil claim, and we spend the next several years in court with those photographs as evidence. And every person in Abuakwa and beyond learns exactly how the Esa family built their fortune." She looked at him steadily. "I don't want to do that. My father doesn't want that. He has spent 30 years choosing not to do that. But I am not my father's Patience. I am my mother's daughter. And my mother, I am told, was a woman who finished things." She walked toward the door. "If this story is moving you, subscribe now to Folktales of the Motherland. The ending will change how you see everything." Behind her, a voice said, "Wait, say stop it." She did not turn around immediately. She let the word settle. Then she turned. Victor Osei was still seated at the head of his long table, in his large room, with his ceiling fans turning slowly above him. But something about him had changed so fundamentally that the room itself seemed different. He looked, for the first time since Grace had met him, like a man rather than a weather system. "Your father," he said. His voice was rough, in a way it had not been before. Is he in pain?" Grace said nothing. "The joint condition," Victor said. "Is he in a great deal of pain?" "Yes," she said. "He is." Victor Osei pressed his hands flat on the table. He said, "The man who kept my father's secret for 30 years, who protected me from the consequences of what my family did, and never asked for a single thing in return." His voice had gone very quiet. "And I came to his daughter with money and a condition, and called it a proposition." He put his hands over his face. His shoulders moved once, like something large and locked shifting for the first time. "And the man who had tested 100 people and found them all wanting sat in his grand room on the hill and wept for the first time since his wife had died on a Tuesday with breakfast still warm on the stove." Grace watched him. She did not look away. She let him be witnessed. 3 weeks later, Daniel Osei returned to Abuakwa. He brought with him a solicitor from the capital, 2 witnesses, and a set of documents that represented more legal honesty than the USA family name had contained in 30 years. In the sitting room of Victor's compound, the same long table, the same ceiling fans, the documents were signed. The acknowledgment was witnessed. The fund was formally established. Its name, written in careful legal language at the top of the founding document, was the Kwame Mensah Community Medical Fund. Grace was present. She had brought her father. Samuel Mensah had not been told the full details in advance. Grace had told him only that there was a meeting he needed to attend, that it was important, and that she needed him to come. She had helped him dress that morning in his good shirt, the one he kept for church, with the fine stitching that his shaking hands had somehow managed to keep perfect, and she had driven him up the hill in a borrowed car, watching his face as the gates opened. He had gone very still when he saw Victor Osei waiting in the doorway. The 2 men regarded each other across the 2 men who had once been boys on the same street, finishing each other's sentences. 50 years of silence and injustice and loss and grief and a box under a work table had all poured itself into the space between them. The morning smelled of cut grass and something warmer, something living. Victor walked towards Samuel. Samuel did not move. When Victor stopped in front of him, he said, in a voice that Grace would remember for the rest of her life, "Samuel, I'm sorry for what my father did, and for what I did not do when I should have." Samuel Mensah looked at the man who had been his friend. He was quiet for a long moment. The morning birds were singing in the garden old songs, the kind that belonged to rivers and patience, and the earth. "I know," Samuel said. "I have known you were sorry for a long time. I was waiting for you to find your way to saying it." They shook hands. It was not a dramatic handshake. It was the handshake of 2 old men who had wasted too much time and knew it. Samuel received his surgery within the month. It was performed at the best hospital in the capital, by a specialist whose fees were covered entirely by the fund bearing his own father's name. Grace sat in the waiting room for 6 hours while the surgeons worked, drinking terrible machine coffee from a paper cup and listening to the hospital sounds around her, the distant beep of monitors, the soft footsteps of nurses, the occasional voice on an intercom calling a name into the fluorescent air. When the surgeon came out and said the procedure had gone well, Grace put her face in her hands and breathed. Not because she was afraid anymore, because she was finished being afraid. The formal public acknowledgement came shortly afterward. Not a legal judgment, but a public statement published in the regional newspaper and read aloud at the town's community hall, in which the Osei family acknowledged the history of the land acquisition and the establishment of the fund as a measure of accountability. Victor stood at the front of the hall and read it himself, in a voice that did not shake, though the air in the room was thick with the weight of 30 years being named aloud. Abu was quiet for a day after that, the kind of quiet that comes not from emptiness, but from fullness, when something that has been held in for too long is finally released. And then, slowly, the town began to speak. 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning, Samuel Mensah sat outside his house in the low, early sun, a piece of fabric across his lap, sewing. His hands were steady. The surgery had restored to his joints a precision he had not felt in years, and the stitching that emerged from his needle was fine, and even the stitching of a craftsman, not a man diminished. A was singeing, one of the old songs about rivers and patience and the earth, and the sound of it moved through the open window of the house, where Grace sat at the table with a cup of tea, listening. She had not left Abuakwa. The Mensah Community Medical Fund had, in its first 6 months, provided medical assistance to 11 families in the town, 2 surgeries, several courses of medication, 3 specialist consultations that would otherwise have been impossible. Auntie Efua, whose eyesight had been failing, received cataract surgery in the 3rd month, and had described the experience of seeing clearly again as God arguing with my doubts and winning. The fund was administered by a small committee that included Grace, Daniel Osei, and 2 elected community members. Victor had honored every commitment, without exception or delay. Victor himself had changed in ways that the town noticed and discussed in the way towns discuss everything. Gradually, as a collective observation, he was seen, on a Saturday morning, helping to repair the roof of the old community hall without being asked. He attended church for the first time in 11 years, since Abina had died, and sat in the 3rd row, and sang the hymns in a voice that was rusty but genuine. He stopped testing people. He seemed, slowly, to be learning that a man who has spent his whole life looking for the worst in others will eventually find it, not because it is everywhere, but because that is what his eyes have been trained to see, and that the cure is not cynicism but courage. Grace found a different kind of work. A textiles cooperative in the regional capital had heard about her, in the way that stories travel through communities when the story is worth carrying, and they offered her a position managing their community outreach program, connecting artisans in small towns with markets in the capital and beyond. She accepted. She commuted 3 days a week and spent the remaining days in Abu at her father's house, where the curtains she had sewn herself still hung in the windows. She had not sold her presence in this town. She had not sold her grandfather's memory, or her father's silence, or her own dignity for any number placed in front of her. And in choosing that, she had built something that no amount of money could have assembled a town that was beginning, slowly, to understand that justice is not a verdict. It is a daily practice. It is a choice made fresh every morning, to keep faith with the truth of things. On the day the fund was named, the day the brass plaque bearing her grandfather's name was installed on the wall of the clinic it now supported, Grace stood in front of it for a long time. The metal was warm from the afternoon sun. Her grandfather's name was simple and clear in the light. Kwame Mensah. She placed her hand on it. The warmth moved through her palm. Behind her, she heard her father's voice. He had come to stand beside her. He looked at his father's name on the wall and was quiet for a moment in the way of men who have carried something heavy for a very long time, and are only now setting it down. He would have liked this. Samuel Said. Yes, Grace said. He would have. They stood together in the afternoon light, father and daughter, at the bottom of the hill where they had always lived. And the hill, for the first time, did not feel like something above them. It felt like ground. Solid, equal, ordinary ground. The man who had placed $10,000 on a table and called it a choice had expected Grace to reach for it. He had built an entire philosophy of human nature on the certainty that everyone, given the right number, would reach. But Grace Mensah had looked at the money, at the clean stack of it, at the future it promised, at the freedom it offered. And she had understood something that Victor Osei, for all his wealth and power, had forgotten. Some things cannot be purchased, and the girl who knows which things those are, that girl will never truly be poor. The man who had tested 100 people was broken not by failure, but by something far more humbling. He was broken by grace, the ordinary, impossible, ancient grace of a young woman who looked at everything he had to offer and chose her father instead, and in being broken that way, he was, at long last, repaired. Thank you for joining us for this story. Subscribe to us and click the bell icon so you never miss a story like this one. And watch our next story right here. It is waiting for you.